First of all, I would like to thank all of you for being here, also in the name of my father. It is indeed, I'm very glad to see so many old faces from the past. Also, I would like to take the opportunity to thank for all the letters and the postcards in which you expressed your condolence. That was indeed very helpful in those sad hours. Furthermore, I would like to thank the Department of Mathematics and the CIF for their generous help and that they made all this possible. Last but not least, I would like to thank the employees and colleagues of my father for their personal effort to organize this memorial. Well, I think that there's a lot I could say about my father, but I think that there's a lot even more which cannot be expressed in words. However, most of you experienced my father in the different times of his life, and I bet that almost everybody in here is able to tell a special story about him. I, for myself, well, I think we will certainly have the pleasure to listen to one or the other story later on. I, for myself, shared many exciting events with him that I all carry in my heart forever. For this special occasion, I would like to tell you a few stories, believing that most of you didn't hear them before. They may not be the most funny ones or the most exciting ones, but for some reason I kept them in mind quite well. And I'm quite sure that most of you will be easily remembered by him by hearing those stories. Let me begin with a few stories that he and other people told me. The first one happened in his early childhood. He must have been 7 or 8. As my mother already told you, he grew up on a farm with one older brother and 2 younger sisters. But there were also a lot of other children who used to play around the farmhouse of my grandparents. And of course, they used to do a lot of nonsense that often made the older people very angry. So once in a while, when the youngsters did too much nonsense, all the people on the farm gathered together to watch how my grandfather, who was very strong, took one boy after the other to hit him with his belt on his behind. He used, in the defense of my grandfather, I have to point out that he thought that this was necessary to educate the young people. Well, anyway, my grandfather used to start with the oldest one and used to end up with the youngest. Since my father belonged to the younger ones, he had a lot of time to experience the older one suffering and screaming. And on that day, the screaming and the suffering was very intense because my grandfather used to hit harder than ever. And after my father had observed his older brother groaning bitterly, my grandfather finally ordered him to step into the circle. But for some strange reason, my father showed no reaction after he was beaten the first time. And the same thing went on as he was beaten the second and the third time. No reaction at all. And everybody, especially my grandfather, was wondering about that phenomenon. And as the procedure went on without any success, the people became more and more amused, and the situation became more and more uncomfortable for my grandfather, who was a highly respected person in the village. But my grandfather was surely too intelligent to go on in the same manner, so he suddenly stopped, put my father on his feet, and asked him, "What trick are you playing on me this time?" And at that moment, my father knew that my grandfather wouldn't go on hitting him again. So he pulled out a pillow out of his trousers and started to laugh. And after the whole crowd broke out into a big laughter, finally also my grandfather had to laugh about that clever trick. And as far as I know, that was the last time that my grandfather used a belt as an instrument of education. The second story took place in the early youth of my father during confirmation class. The pastor who taught the kids was a very strict man. And since the confirmation exam came closer, the pastor started to repeat what he already taught the class. And he appreciated getting short and exact answers to his questions. But since the kids preferred to make nonsense instead of listening to his words, they often gave wrong and confusing answers. As a matter of fact, my father had the gift to pick up at least some information without really listening, with the result that he could sometimes satisfy the pastor at least a little bit. And one day, he made him very happy by giving him a totally right answer. The question was, when is Whitsun? And my father answered, 7 weeks after Easter. And the pastor was really amazed and said, very good, my boy. You are the only one in this lazy class who at least knows a little bit. And so he went on asking my father, since you know the time of Whitsun, you surely can also tell me when is Easter? And of course, the pastor wanted to hear the day when Christ rose from the dead. But my father, who knew exactly what the pastor wanted to hear, answered as short and as precisely as before, 7 weeks before Whitsun. And of course, the pastor was anything but amused at that answer. And as a punishment, my father had to write exactly 7 pages about the plague of silliness. Now let me go on with a story that might bring a little pleasure to the mathematicians among us. The story happened in the geometry class in high school. The teacher had just presented a new sentence to the pupils, asked them if they understood it. And after a period of silence, my father answered that he understood the sentence, but that he's still waiting for the proof. The teacher was a little bit irritated by that, but he began to explain the sentence again. And after he had finished, my father repeated promptly, without being asked, this is still not the proof. And as most of you know, school teachers were very big authorities at those days. And therefore the teacher became very angry about my father's behavior. But at the same time, he also knew that he still hadn't proved the sentence. So hoping that my father would say nothing, he explained the sentence for a third time. And after he had finished, he looked at my father and said, well, my friend, since everything should be clear now, I'm willing to forgive you for criticizing me. And then he asked my father, still a little bit nervous, if he could forgive him as well. And my father answered that he was willing to forgive him too, but that he was still interested in getting the proof. Now I will tell you a few stories that I had the pleasure to be a part of. Let me start with one from my early childhood. I was about 10 or 11 when my father came back from China with an interesting present. It was a coat hanger that you could fold up so you could carry it with you wherever you go. And for some reason, my father was very proud of this present, probably because you couldn't buy such a thing in Europe at those days. However, after a while, he forgot about the coat hanger, and the thing ended up in the closet. And one day I showed it to a friend of mine, who just like me took every opportunity he could get to play jokes upon my father, quite in the same manner my father did when he was young in front of the grown-ups. So my friend took the coat hanger, went to my father's desk, where he used to work in the afternoon, and said to him, look, Rudi, what I've got here. I've got a present for you. And my father was often somewhere else in his thoughts, as my mother mentioned. And he looked up and said, oh, thank you, my boy. This is very nice of you. And since my father started to inspect the coat hanger with a lot of fascination, my friend went into my room and we started to play something else. And after 10 minutes, my father came to my room and said to my friend, well, my boy, it is very nice of you that you wanted to make me a present. But how could you make me a present with something that already belongs to me? And like so often, everything ended up in a big laughter. The second story happened in my early youth, when I was about 14. My friends and I used to play a lot in the garden at the time, and one of our favorite games was shooting with little peas at each other. We had special plastic pistols for this purpose, with which we used to fire the peas at each other. Unfortunately, our game was suddenly interrupted by an angry neighbor who was a former colonel in the German military. However, the colonel was complaining that he had already found peace on his territory and that he felt personally attacked by that. And since we liked our game too much, we didn't follow his order to stop it. As you can imagine, the colonel was very insulted by that and wrote a long letter to my father in which he pronounced that he never experienced such an indisciplined behavior in his whole career. Well, my father didn't seem to take the whole thing too seriously, but at least he told us to stop the playing at the frontier. And so we did. Then one day when I was helping in the garden, the colonel saw us and asked my father why he didn't answer his letter. My father replied that we had already stopped playing this game in the garden and that therefore was no further need for discussion and explanations. And the colonel, who obviously wanted my father to apologize for our behavior, said that this was fine, but that my father had to know that if we would play the game again, he would call the police immediately. And my father answered, slightly amused, that would be cowardice in front of the enemy. And the colonel was obviously didn't expect such an answer, was for once left speechless. The last story I'm going to tell you happened many years later. It must have been in my early 20s when my father one evening called me on the phone from his office to tell me that our car had been stolen. I was very surprised and asked him if that was for sure. He answered that he had inspected the whole parking lot without any success. Since my father used to park the car on the north side of the university, I asked him if he had parked the car there this time too. And he answered that this time he couldn't find a free parking lot on the north side, so he left the car on the south side. But since he couldn't find it there, he assumed that the car was stolen. My first thought was that my father probably just didn't see the car. So I decided to check the south side by myself. But as I arrived there, I couldn't find it either. So I went to my father's office, where we decided to call the police. As they told us that the car might be already taken to a foreign country by the thieves, I got very depressed because this was the first car I had ever driven and I liked it very much. And as time went by, I got more and more angry and damned those criminals who had stolen our car. And since I still couldn't really believe that the car was stolen, I asked my father again if he was really sure that he parked the car on the south side. My father, who was already in a very bad mood too, answered that he surely parked the car on the south side, and how could I dare to doubt his statement? Well, although I could see that my father was very convinced of his version, I decided to convince myself. So I gave it a last chance and made my way to the north side of the university. And the closer I came, the more I felt my heart beating and my hope vanishing. But suddenly, as I came closer to the parking lot, something was sparkling at the horizon. Something blue metallic with 4 wheels. And as I arrived at the north side, I saw something very well known standing on the parking lot, lonely and deserted, as if it had been standing there for 1,000 years. And I still see myself falling on the front of the car, kissing its bonnet. And I still remember that this evening was one of the most happy ones in my life. And my father, after an initial shock, was really relieved too. Thank you for your attention.